December 24th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Western Front. Snow drifted like ash through a night without color. The war had gone silent, but the silence was not peace. It was exhaustion. Beneath shattered pine trees, the world was white, broken, and waiting. Inside a small cabin near the Belgian border, a fire cracked weakly. 3 American soldiers huddled around it, their rifles resting against the wall. Their uniforms were damp, boots half frozen. They were lost, hungry, and far from their lines. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the wooden door, deliberate, cautious. The youngest soldier reached for his weapon. Outside, the snow moved again, and shapes emerged. German voices. 3 of them! Officers by the sound of their accents. Armed, exhausted, and just as cold. For a breathless moment, time held its breath. The Americans aimed, the Germans froze. But from within, a woman's voice broke the standoff. Soft, steady, unafraid. "Tonight," she said, "there will be no shooting." The rifles lowered. The door opened, and for one extraordinary night, enemies shared the same fire and the same Christmas dinner. By late December 1944, Europe had entered its coldest winter in decades. The world was already weary of death. But in the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, a new storm was gathering. Not of weather, but of war. Adolf Hitler had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, a massive surprise counteroffensive intended to split the Allied front in 2. It was his final gamble, an attempt to recapture the momentum Germany had lost after D-Day. More than 200,000 German troops moved silently through the Ardennes forest, hidden beneath fog and snow. Their orders were ruthless. Drive to Antwerp, sever the Allied army, and force a negotiated peace before Germany's inevitable defeat. On the other side, the Americans were caught off guard. Many of them were young replacements, fresh from training camps, untested under fire. They manned what was believed to be a quiet sector. Few expected anything more than routine patrols and cold nights. Then, in the early hours of December 16, 1944, the German artillery opened up. Over 1,600 guns firing at once. The blast echoed across hills and valleys, turning calm forests into infernos. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Within days, confusion spread across the American lines. The Germans attacked in small armored spearheads, using captured U.S. equipment and fluent English-speaking troops disguised as Americans to sow chaos. Communication broke down. Units became isolated. Some soldiers, cut off by snowdrifts and destroyed bridges, wandered blindly through the forest, starving, frost-bitten, and unsure who was friend or foe. It was in this chaos that 3 American soldiers, Private Ralph Blank, Corporal Paul Needham, and Sergeant Harry Adams, found themselves lost near Hurtgen Forest. Close to the Belgian border, their jeep had been destroyed by artillery fire. Their rations were gone. For days, they trudged through waist-deep snow, guided only by the faint glow of burning villages and the echo of distant guns. The landscape offered no comfort, only the groan of wind through broken trees and the dull thud of mortars. Miles away, the Ardennes was a frozen labyrinth. Hills, ridges, and narrow valleys where entire divisions could disappear. And in late 1944, they often did. In those conditions, even survival blurred the lines between sides. Both German and American patrols were reduced to the same basics: food, warmth, shelter. A farmhouse or hunting cabin could mean life or death. That was how the 3 Americans stumbled upon a small wooden cabin hidden among the fir trees. Its chimney smoked faintly, a sign of life. Inside, they found Elisabeth Vincken, a German woman, and her 12-year-old son, Fritz. They were civilians, refugees from Aachen, taking shelter deep in the woods. When the soldiers entered, Elisabeth understood immediately who they were. Their uniforms said it all. But she did not scream. She did not push them away. Instead, she looked at their pale faces, frost-bitten hands, and trembling bodies, and simply said, "Come in. You must be freezing." For the Americans, it was the first warmth they had felt in days. For the woman and her son, it was the first time they had shared their fire with the enemy. Outside, snow continued to fall, heavy and soundless. But in the forest, Other lost soldiers were still moving. Among them, a small group of German officers, also cut off from their command, searching desperately for shelter. Their paths were about to cross, and by Christmas Eve, fate would bring them to the same cabin on the same night. At the same hour, the Battle of the Bulge had entered its second week. By December 23rd, the fog that had hidden the German advance began to lift. From the air, Allied pilots could finally see the full scale of the devastation below. Smoking forests, frozen corpses, wrecked convoys half buried in snow. The neat symmetry of war was gone. What remained was chaos. Across the front, soldiers spoke of a strange quiet that came between bombardments, a quiet broken only by wind, or the distant clang of metal from wrecked tanks being stripped for warmth. The winter of 1944 was merciless. Temperatures fell below 20 degrees, and frostbite claimed more men than bullets. The 3 Americans inside Elisabeth Vincken's cabin were among those who had simply vanished from their unit rosters. The 121st Infantry Regiment had lost contact with them days earlier. In official reports, they were listed as missing, presumed captured, or dead. But in truth, they were still alive, sustained by luck and the generosity of a German mother and her son. Elisabeth's home had once been a hunting lodge. Its walls were thick logs sealed with mud, its single window covered with a wool blanket. Inside, there was little food, just a few potatoes, a loaf of bread, and a thin chicken they had been saving for Christmas. The Americans, respectful and exhausted, offered what they could: some chocolate, a bit of coffee, and a small tin of sugar. That night, as snow pressed against the roof and the wind howled through the trees, Elisabeth told her son quietly, "If God has led them to our door, we must feed them." She didn't care for uniforms. She saw only faces. Her faith was her law, and war had already taken everything else. Meanwhile, just a few kilometers away, another group of soldiers fought their way through the same forest. 4 German officers, part of a retreating patrol from the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division. They had been cut off when Allied artillery destroyed a bridge behind them. For 2 days, they wandered the forest, low on ammunition and nearly frozen. One of them, a young lieutenant named Hans Kunkel, carried a wounded comrade on his shoulder. Another, a medic, clutched a small white cloth tied to a branch, not as a flag of surrender, but as a desperate signal for mercy if they met civilians. By the evening of December 24th, they too saw a glow through the trees, faint, orange, flickering against the snow. The sound of voices carried in the stillness, a woman's voice. And then English. They stopped. No soldier wanted to die on Christmas Eve, but neither could they turn back. The forest offered no mercy. Inside the cabin, Elisabeth was preparing the meager Christmas meal. The chicken roasted slowly over the fire, the smell filling the small room. The Americans had taken off their boots, drying their socks near the flames. It was the first moment of calm they had known in weeks. Then came the knock. 3 short raps, steady, deliberate. Fritz, frightened, looked to his mother. She held up her hand, signaling silence. The Americans stiffened. Rifles were within reach. Outside, German voices called out. They spoke carefully, not shouting, not demanding. One voice asked for shelter, saying they had a wounded man. Elisabeth stepped to the door. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained firm. "You may come in," she said. "But remember, tonight is Christmas. There will be no shooting here." It was a command, not a plea. The Germans hesitated, then entered, slowly, hands raised, weapons slung over their shoulders. In that moment, the impossible had happened. Americans and Germans stood face to face, in the middle of a war that had consumed millions, inside a cabin smaller than a single tank. And yet, no one moved. No one fired. Elisabeth looked at them, the newcomers' pale faces, frostbitten cheeks, and weary eyes. Then she pointed toward the fire and said softly, "There is room for all. Sit." That night, the Ardennes was silent. The war outside still raged, but inside that cabin, for a few fragile hours, it would stop. Inside the cabin, the air was dense with warmth and uncertainty. The firelight flickered across uniforms of 2 nations at war. The crackle of the fire became the only sound, replacing the rhythm of gunfire that had ruled their lives. No one knew where to sit. The Americans, though outnumbered, stayed near their weapons. Instinct more than intention. The Germans, disciplined even in exhaustion, waited for orders that would never come. And in the center, between both sides, stood a woman and her son, civilians, who had somehow become the arbiters of peace. Elisabeth Vincken divided the space with her quiet authority. She ordered all weapons to be placed outside the door. There was a long pause, a moment of hesitation that might have broken the fragile truce. Then one German lieutenant stepped forward, unslung his rifle, and set it down in the snow. An American followed, then another. For the first time in years, these men were simply human beings in a warm room. Surrounded by the smell of food and pine wood, the transformation was almost physical. The stiffness in their shoulders eased. The lines of suspicion softened. It wasn't peace. It was something smaller, more intimate. Recognition. They were all cold, hungry, and terrified, and somehow that sameness felt stronger than the symbols stitched onto their sleeve. The moral authority in that cabin did not come from military rank or ideology. It came from Elisabeth Vincken, a German mother whose sense of decency had survived years of war. She was not a soldier, but she had known loss. Her husband was away, drafted into the Volkssturm. She had seen her city, Aachen, bombed into rubble. Yet, on that night, she chose not to see enemies, but souls. When she spoke, her words carried a weight no officer could challenge. "You are all hungry," she said. "We will share what we have." Her son, Fritz, remembered her calm years later. She told them that they were brothers now, he wrote, and that if they wanted to fight, they would have to leave her house first. It was not faith in war's end that guided her. It was faith in simple humanity. She took the single chicken they had been saving for Christmas and began to prepare it for all 7 men. She added what little she had: potatoes, bread, and a handful of oats. The soldiers, regardless of flag, sat silently, ashamed that she was feeding them when she herself had so little. The Americans offered their coffee. The Germans produced a bottle of wine they had carried since the start of the campaign. They passed it around slowly, careful not to spill a drop. Each sip felt like a confession that they had all been part of something much larger and far crueler than themselves. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like distant artillery. But inside, the cabin glowed with the fragile warmth of conscience. For the German officers, this moment was beyond comprehension. They had been raised under an empire of obedience, conditioned to see compassion as weakness, mercy as treason. And now, an unarmed woman was telling them to lay down their weapons in front of the enemy. Lieutenant Kunkel later admitted in his post-war journal that he expected to die that night. "Either the Americans would shoot us, or our own conscience would," he wrote. But no one fired. "We sat together like strangers on a train, unsure why we were there, unable to leave." He described watching the Americans, young, exhausted, whispering among themselves about families back home. One soldier showed a worn photograph of his wife and daughter. The German medic, silent for most of the night, nodded quietly. He too had a child the same age. Something shifted then, a silent recognition that went beyond words. They were reflections of each other, each man living a mirrored version of the same fear. By midnight, the tension in the room had faded into something else: fatigue, maybe even peace. They ate slowly, taking turns passing the small portions so that everyone received something. When it was over, Elisabeth bowed her head and prayed aloud. The soldiers followed her lead, Germans in whispered "Amen," Americans murmuring in English, different languages, same silence. That night, the war paused, not across Europe, but in one small wooden room, deep in the frozen Ardennes. And outside, the stars flickered through the storm, as if heaven itself was holding its breath. From a tactical standpoint, the event that unfolded in that cabin was almost impossible. Every military doctrine of the time warned against fraternization with the enemy. It was considered a breach of discipline, punishable by court-martial on both sides. And yet, in the forests of the Ardennes, the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge had eroded every rule written on paper. Units had dissolved into scattered bands. Front lines were invisible. sometimes shifting by the hour, sometimes overlapping entirely. No one truly knew where the front was anymore. That made survival the only objective. The Americans who found the cabin had lost all sense of direction. Their compasses were frozen, their maps soaked beyond use. The Germans, too, had become ghosts of their own army, soldiers without orders, wandering the white wilderness. What brought them together was not strategy, but geography and chance. In that moment, the tactical landscape of the Ardennes collapsed into something purely human. Two sides, armed with the same rifles, the same fears, the same hunger, separated by nothing more than a wall of propaganda and the flags they once swore to. It was a brief moment in which the mechanics of war failed, replaced by the instincts of survival and decency. To a field commander, it would have seemed trivial. To history, it was monumental. Because in that one night, 7 people demonstrated something no army could order: restraint. While soldiers followed duty, civilians followed conscience. For Elisabeth Vincken, conscience outweighed any loyalty to government or ideology. She was a baker's wife, not a politician, not a soldier. Her only allegiance was to her child and to the belief that goodness must not die, even in war. Her son, Fritz, would later recall how she moved with quiet certainty, as if guided by something higher than fear. She told me, he wrote years later, that even if it cost us our lives, we must not turn anyone away on Christmas Eve. She knew the risk. If German patrols found her harboring American soldiers, she could be shot for treason. If the Americans found her later, she could be accused of aiding the enemy. But she didn't think in terms of sides. She thought in terms of cold, hunger, and the humanity of strangers. In the frozen wasteland of the Ardennes, that cabin became more than shelter. It became a sanctuary, a space where one woman's courage dissolved the boundaries of war, even if only for one night. Years later, historians would describe Elisabeth's act as moral defiance, but to her, it was simply faith in action, the kind that didn't need recognition or reward. It was not rebellion. It was redemption. When she looked around that room, she didn't see uniforms. She saw faces, faces that looked like her husband's, her brother's, her neighbor's. The enemy, she realized, was not the men before her. It was the war that made them enemies. In military history, leadership is often defined by command, but rarely by restraint. This story challenged that definition. When the soldiers returned to their respective lines after Christmas, they carried more than memories. They carried a quiet sense of shame and wonder. Each side reported the encounter to their officers. The American platoon commander, upon hearing of it, reportedly stared in disbelief. He didn't punish them. He didn't commend them either. He simply said, "You were lucky the Germans didn't shoot you," and filed the report away. On the German side, Lieutenant Kunkel also made a report, one laced with caution. He emphasized that no military information was exchanged and that discipline was maintained. But beneath the careful phrasing, one could sense an undertone of reflection, a subtle acknowledgement that they had all seen something larger than orders. For both militaries, what happened that night was an anomaly. It fit nowhere in the manuals of conduct, but among the soldiers who lived it, it became a moral landmark, an event that no one could ever forget. The concept of enemy had cracked, even if only for one snow-covered night. Leadership had been replaced by humanity, and the authority of conscience had prevailed over command. That fragile peace, unrecorded in official war diaries, unmentioned in communiqué, carried forward in the memories of those few who were there. It was proof that even amid the most disciplined violence, the human heart could disobey orders in the name of something higher. And in that small cabin, surrounded by frost and silence, 7 people reminded the world that leadership sometimes means refusing to follow. By dawn, the snow had stopped falling. The first light of December 25th, 1944 crept through the forest, revealing the aftermath of a night that defied the very logic of war. Night had fully descended over the Ardennes. The storm outside had calmed, leaving the forest blanketed in silence. Only the hiss of wind through the pines and the crackle of the fire marked the passing of time. Inside the cabin, 7 people sat together, 3 Americans, 4 Germans, and 1 German mother with her son. The air was thick with heat and wood smoke. Shadows from the fire crawled across their faces, merging uniforms into one indistinguishable blur of exhaustion. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. Every sound, the shifting of boots, the scrape of a tin cup, the pop of a log, felt amplified, fragile. Each man was aware that a single word, a single wrong move, could shatter the illusion of peace. Then, slowly, the woman's voice filled the room. Elisabeth Vincken spoke quietly, but her tone carried the weight of command. She instructed her son, Fritz, to set the table, a crude plank of wood resting on barrels. From a small basket, she placed what food they had: roasted chicken, bread, and boiled potatoes. The aroma filled the room, simple, earthy, and heavy with meaning. The Americans watched silently, unsure whether to trust the gesture. One of them, Sergeant Adams, unwrapped a small tin of coffee and placed it beside the food. Another added a bar of chocolate, his last one. The Germans exchanged glances, then produced what they could: a bottle of red wine and some bread from their ration. It wasn't much, but together it looked like a feast. Elisabeth said, "Grace." Her German words carried softly through the smoke. "Herr, mach uns zu Werkzeugen deines Friedens. Lord, make us instruments of your peace." The Americans bowed their heads. The Germans murmured, "Amen." And for the first time in years, they were united, not by uniform or flag, but by hunger, gratitude, and something wordless that hovered between faith and relief. As they ate, the barriers dissolved further. The German medic checked the wounds of one American who had twisted his ankle during the retreat. He worked quietly, using what little morphine remained in his kit. The American winced, then smiled, a silent thank you across enemy lines. Fritz sat beside them, wide-eyed. To him, it felt like the world had turned upside down. Men who should have been killing each other were now laughing softly over shared food. He later recalled how the youngest American, his hands trembling from cold, handed him a piece of chocolate and said in broken German, "Frohe Weihnachten, kleiner Mann. Merry Christmas, little man." The German lieutenant, Hans Kunkel, looked around the room and said, almost to himself, "If only our generals could see this." No one replied, but everyone understood. For a while, there was laughter. Stories were exchanged in fragments, about home, about wives and children, about the food they missed. They didn't speak of battles or victories. They spoke of normal life, the kind that had vanished years ago. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering the world in white silence. Inside, time seemed to stop. The war, that relentless, grinding machine, felt distant, almost forgotten. Then came the sound, faint, uncertain, of someone humming. It was one of the Germans, a tune so familiar it pierced the room like light through a crack in the wall. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, silent night. The Americans recognized it instantly. Their own voices joined in, hesitant at first, then strong. 2 languages, 1 melody, filling that tiny cabin with something that no weapon could destroy. Fritz remembered watching his mother's face as they sang. Tears traced down her cheeks, catching the firelight. For that moment, she looked at peace, as if she believed the world outside might actually stay quiet forever. When the song ended, no one spoke. The only sound was the fire crackling softly and the whisper of snow against the roof. Later, one of the Germans, a young soldier who had been silent most of the night, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver crucifix. He placed it on the table between them, where the light hit it gently. No one asked why. Everyone knew. It was a symbol, not of surrender, but of shared faith in something beyond the madness of orders and front lines. Hours passed. One by one, the men fell asleep, some sitting, some lying near the fire, their boots steaming gently as the frost melted from the leather. Their weapons remained outside in the snow, forgotten. Elisabeth stayed awake the longest, watching over them. She knew that when morning came, the war would return. The forest would again echo with gunfire and engines. But tonight, just this one night, she would protect the peace she had made, even if it cost her everything. She whispered a prayer into the fire. For one night, Lord, just one night, let them sleep as men, not as enemies. And in that cabin, surrounded by snow and silence, her prayer was answered. Morning came quietly, without the usual thunder of artillery. For a few precious minutes, the forest seemed motionless, snow falling in slow spirals through pale blue light. The cabin, now half buried beneath the night's snowfall, glowed faintly from the embers of its dying fire. Inside, the men stirred slowly, reluctant to wake. Their breath hung in the air, like ghosts. For the first time in weeks, they had slept through a night without gunfire. No sentry posts, no watch rotations, just rest. Elisabeth moved gently between them, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She poured what remained of the coffee into tin mugs, dividing it evenly. The aroma filled the room again, fragile but comforting. When the soldiers finally opened their eyes, the silence felt heavier than before. They all knew it couldn't last. One of the Americans, Sergeant Adams, stood first. He looked toward the door, where snow had blown in through the cracks. His expression was unreadable, caught between gratitude and dread. He knew that the moment he stepped outside, he would once again be a target. The Germans woke soon after. Lieutenant Kunkel rubbed the frost from his boots and adjusted his coat. He glanced across the room to the Americans, men he had eaten with, laughed with, and, for one night, trusted. Now, as daylight sharpened the edges of reality, they were enemies again. The transformation felt almost cruel. Elisabeth seemed to sense the weight of it. She told Fritz to fetch their weapons from outside. The boy hesitated, looking at the rifles stacked in the snow. He didn't want to touch them, the very objects that had made his mother's house both sanctuary and battlefield. When he brought them in, she looked at each man and said quietly, "You came as soldiers, but you will leave as men. I pray you remember this night, wherever you go." There was a pause, that heavy silence that lingers when no one knows what to say. Then, one by one, the soldiers began to speak. The American corporal offered his hand to the German medic. They shook briefly, firm, without words. Another American removed a patch from his sleeve and handed it to Fritz. It was a small cloth insignia, the 121st Infantry Division patch, an emblem of a war that, for one night, had no meaning. The Germans reciprocated. One of them pulled from his pocket a small folding knife, its handle carved with initials. He pressed it into the boy's hand. "For luck," he said in German. Fritz would keep it for decades. Before leaving, Lieutenant Kunkel turned to Elisabeth. He removed his gloves, took her hand and said softly, "Frau Vincken, you gave us back something we thought was gone." She only smiled, weary but resolute. "Then keep it," she said, "and don't lose it again." The men gathered their things. The Americans prepared to head west. The Germans, east, each back toward the chaos they had escaped. Elisabeth opened the door. The morning light was blinding, white upon white, erasing tracks as fast as they were made. They stepped outside, side by side, before turning in opposite directions. No salutes, no commands, just nods. Acknowledgement. Fritz stood in the doorway, watching them fade into the forest mist. First, the Americans disappeared among the pines, their silhouettes swallowed by snow. Then the Germans turned down another path, their gray coats blending with the trees. Within minutes, the cabin stood alone again, surrounded by silence. Elisabeth closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. The warmth from the fire was fading fast, but something else, something unseen, lingered in the air. A peace no bullet could shatter, born in a place that should never have known it. Later that day, far away, the Battle of the Bulge raged on. German armor pushed deeper toward Bastogne. American lines fought to hold. Tens of thousands would die in the days that followed. No one in headquarters would ever know about the cabin in the woods. No one would write it in official records or war diaries. But among those who were there, it became a story they carried for life. For the Germans, it was a reminder that honor wasn't measured by victory. For the Americans, it was proof that even in the darkest war, decency could survive. And for one German mother and her son, it was simply a night when faith had been stronger than fear. Years later, Fritz Vincken, grown and living far from Europe, would still recall every sound: the knock on the door, the first German voice, the shared prayer, and the song that rose from the firelight. In his memory, the faces of those soldiers never aged. They remained as they were that night, tired, thin and human. When asked what he learned from it, he said that even when the world has gone mad, one act of kindness can still make sense. And so, the truce of that Christmas night ended as quietly as it began, with snow, silence, and 7 souls walking back into a war that never stopped waiting. By dawn on December 26, 1944, the forest had returned to its natural sound, wind sighing through branches, snow cracking under weight, and distant guns rumbling far beyond the horizon. The little cabin where peace had been shared stood untouched, its chimney still breathing faint smoke into the frozen sky. No one outside its walls knew what had happened there. To the armies on both sides, it was simply another winter morning in the Ardennes, another day of orders, casualties, and confusion. The Battle of the Bulge raged on. German forces continued to press westward, but their momentum was fading. Fuel shortages crippled their tanks, and the Allied air forces, grounded by weather during the initial attack, returned with devastating precision once the skies cleared. Villages like Bastogne, St. Vith, and Houffalize became names synonymous with endurance and sacrifice. The Americans who had shared that Christmas dinner were among thousands trying to regroup with their units. Sergeant Harry Adams and Corporal Paul Needham were eventually found by a reconnaissance patrol from the 8th Infantry Division. Cold, exhausted, but alive. They never spoke of the cabin to their commanders. In war, stories like that seemed almost out of place, too fragile for the official reports. The Germans who had been there also vanished into the tide of retreat. By early January, Hitler's great offensive had failed. The Ardennes counterattack cost Germany over 100,000 casualties. Men, tanks, and aircraft they could never replace. It was the last major offensive of the Third Reich. For civilians, the aftermath was even more brutal. Villages lay in ruin, roads choked with burnt-out armor, and forests littered with bodies half buried in snow. When spring came, the dead were still being found beneath the melting drifts. Elisabeth and Fritz remained in their cabin through the winter, surviving on what little they had. For months, no one came. The front lines shifted back east, leaving the region scarred but silent. When the Americans finally liberated the area, they found the woman and her son still alive, malnourished but safe. They offered her evacuation and ration. Elisabeth refused to leave. She wanted to stay where she had seen God walk through her door, as she later described it. The Americans were baffled. To them, this was just another war-torn farmhouse in a forest full of ghosts. They did not know that for one night, it had been the most peaceful place on Earth. As the war dragged toward its end, the Rhine crossings, the fall of Berlin, the discovery of the concentration camps, stories like hers were buried under the avalanche of larger events. There were no witnesses who wrote it down, no journalists who heard of it. The world moved on, counting victories and losses, not kindnesses. Elisabeth never saw the soldiers again, but she spoke often of that night to her son, repeating the details, the way the firelight danced on their faces, the way the snow fell when they left. She wanted him to remember that even in the heart of madness, there had been decency. Fritz grew up with that story as his most sacred inheritance. After the war, he emigrated to Hawaii, where he opened a small bakery. He carried his mother's words with him like scripture. For decades, no one outside his family knew the story. It was too unbelievable, too perfect, too human for the chaos of war records. But time, like snow, has a way of uncovering what once was hidden. In the late 1970s, nearly 35 years later, a German television program investigating untold stories of the Ardennes featured a short segment about a Christmas truce in the woods. A viewer in Hawaii, Fritz Vincken, recognized every word. He wrote to the producers. Within weeks, the truth began to surface. Names, units, surviving veterans, and slowly, the fragments of that forgotten night began to align. By then, Elisabeth had passed away, but her act of mercy, once seen by no one, was about to be remembered by millions, and what emerged From those memories was more than a story, was proof that even war cannot erase humanity, only hide it for a while beneath the snow. When Fritz Vincken's letter reached Germany in 1971, it was little more than a few handwritten pages. He described what he had seen as a boy, the knock on the door, the soldiers' faces, the shared prayer, and the uneasy peace that followed. He didn't know their names. He didn't remember unit numbers or insignia. All he knew was that 3 American soldiers and 3 German soldiers had shared a Christmas dinner with his mother, somewhere near the Ardennes front in December 1944. Producers from the German television program Ein Herz für Kinder were skeptical at first. War had created countless myths, and the line between memory and legend often blurred with time. But something about Fritz's story felt different, detailed, restrained, and without embellishment. They aired his account in a short documentary segment. It lasted barely 10 minutes. Across the Atlantic, a veteran in the United States, Ralph Blank, was watching. He had served in the Ardennes that winter and recognized the description immediately. The woman, the cabin, the dinner. He had lived it. He wrote to the program, confirming every detail. 2 others followed, former comrades who had also survived that night. Their testimonies matched Fritz's perfectly, down to the smallest gesture. After nearly 30 years, the fragments of the story aligned for the first time. The producers arranged for a reunion. It would take place not in Europe, but but in Hawaii, where Fritz had settled with his wife and children. In 1972, on a warm spring morning, a camera crew set up inside Fritz's small bakery in Honolulu. The air smelled of bread and coffee, the same scents that had once filled his mother's cabin. He waited nervously, standing behind the counter, until the door opened and a man in his 50s stepped inside. It was Ralph Blank, the American private from that night. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ralph smiled, his eyes wet. "You were the boy," he said quietly. Fritz nodded. "And you were one of the men who came to our door." They embraced, 2 strangers bound by one memory that had refused to die. News of their reunion spread quickly. American networks picked it up, followed by European outlets. Letters poured in from around the world. Veterans, widows, teachers, priests, all calling it the truest Christmas story ever told. It wasn't just a war story anymore. It was a human one. In the years that followed, the account appeared in magazines, newspapers, and books. It was even dramatized on radio and television under titles like The Truce in the Forest and Silent Night in the Ardennes. Each retelling brought new eyes to a moment that had almost been erased. But for Fritz, the story remained deeply personal. He often said he didn't tell it for fame or for history, only to honor his mother. He called her the bravest person I ever knew, not because she defied soldiers, but because she refused to let hatred cross her doorstep. Elisabeth's legacy grew quietly. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, Fritz was invited to speak at a memorial in Germany. He stood before veterans from both sides and told them, "My mother believed that compassion could survive any war." That night, she proved it. There was silence after he spoke. Some men wept openly. Others simply nodded, understanding, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to win peace. When Fritz died in 2002, he was buried with a simple cross. At the base of it, someone placed a small wooden carving of a cabin. No words, no plaque, just a reminder. The site of the original house, deep in the woods near Hürtgen, still exists, though rebuilt. A small sign now stands there, reading, "Here." On Christmas Eve 1944, German and American soldiers shared bread instead of bullets. The snow still falls the same way in that forest. The wind still moves through the trees like a memory. And sometimes, if you walk the paths quietly, you can almost imagine the faint scent of coffee and the echo of a song, the last song sung before the guns began again. History remembers wars in numbers, battles, divisions, casualties, and maps marked by shifting front lines. But between those statistics lie moments that rarely make it into textbooks, brief flickers of humanity that defy the logic of violence. The Christmas truce in the Ardennes was one such flicker. It did not change the outcome of the war. No treaties were signed, no generals took credit, no monuments were built in its honor. And yet, for those who were there, it became the most meaningful victory they ever experienced. A victory over fear, hatred, and blind obedience. In that frozen forest, 7 people discovered that compassion could exist even when the world insisted it could not. They were enemies by uniform, but not by soul. They proved that war may command men to kill, but it cannot command them to forget they are human. Decades later, when historians tried to categorize what happened that night, they struggled to define it. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't defiance. It was something quieter, a refusal to let darkness dictate every choice. Perhaps that is why the story endures, because it speaks to something larger than the Second World War, something that reaches across time and borders. It reminds us that even in chaos, one act of mercy can ripple outward for generations. A shared meal, a song, a door opened to strangers in the snow. Those are the moments that survive long after the guns fall silent. Today, when visitors stand near the spot where the cabin once stood, they find no grand monument, only a modest plaque and the whisper of wind through the pines. But if they close their eyes, they might still hear echoes of laughter and clinking cups, of men who forgot for one night what it meant to be enemies. In the end, that is the legacy of Elisabeth Vincken's cabin, not a story of war, but of peace rediscovered. A reminder that even amid history's darkest winter, there are still lights that never go out.